So our final session is called Inequality Matters. And it brings together the threads of equality and inequality that form one of the pillars of this year's meeting. This session will take the form of an intimate conversation between two people. Between Olivier Fleurot, CEO of the MSLGROUP, and Christine Lagarde, the Managing Director of the IMF. In this session, they'll be looking at how one organization, albeit a very large one with a global reach, is tackling the inequality issue and what that means for the rest of us. So could I please invite our two speakers to the floor? Thank you very much.
Well, well.
It was all for you.
Thank you so much for being here. You know that Christine Lagarde just had the most important meeting, the IMF annual meeting and the World Bank annual meeting with, I think, at least 185 countries represented, right? And it only ended at the beginning of the week, and it's great to have her here today. Do I really need to introduce Christine Lagarde? I'm not sure. But everybody probably remembers that you were the first woman to be chairman of the international law firm Baker & McKenzie back in 1999. And you held after that many ministerial posts in France, starting with trade minister, then agriculture, and then you became the first woman, because Christine had a lot of firsts, to be in the Ministry of Finance, Economic Affairs and Employment back in 2007. The first woman ever in charge of economic policy in France. You were in that position, by the way, when the financial crisis started, just after you were appointed in 2008. So you might have a certain number of things also that you remember from that period. And in June 2011, you were elected by the IMF board as the next managing director and chairman for a 5-year term. We should remember that. You are known to be extremely resilient. You managed to deal with issues with clarity, energy, and enthusiasm. And those who know you very well say that your elegant style is only matched by a very generous and elegant soul. So I thought maybe we could start with the first question. You've just had probably an amazing overview of the global economic situation with all those countries. Could you share with us a few highlights, a few challenges, new challenges, or hope? Or
Sure. Happy to do that. But also, let me tell you that I'm really, really happy to be with you, and your greeting meant a lot to me, and it really felt warm and extremely nice. So thank you for that. Now, thank you for giving me a chance to talk about really serious issues, because I think that what's happening in the world at the moment really warrants our attention. What we did over the last pretty much 8 days, when we have 180 roughly ministers of finance from all over the world, 150 central bankers from the same countries, that we just, look under the skin of the global economy to understand what is going on, what are the challenges, and what are the policy options. And we coined it this year to avoid the risk of new mediocre. Let's make sure we all adopt a new momentum. Now, I know this is a little bit sort of cryptic, but what we're trying to say here is that there is a global recovery. We downgraded it from 3.7 to 3.3 in 2015, and we downgraded again for 2015 to 3.8. But what's more important is that we also downgraded and reduced the growth potential for the medium term. And that's, more of a concern. Now, some might argue and say, well, you know what? The last 25 years before the financial crisis, global growth was roughly 3.8%. So why should we worry? Well, the worry is that we have two big legacies from the crisis, and we have challenges that are what I would call risks. The two big legacies we have is, first of all, 200 million people looking for a job. And that's a huge big one, and a 3.3% annual growth will not create the jobs that are needed for them. And the second legacy is that most countries, particularly the advanced economies, have inherited from the crisis because they had to increase the deficit, they had to borrow their way out of the crisis, but as a result, there is a large level of debt in pretty much all advanced economies. And the global level of debt around the world at the moment is 100%. So debt to GDP ratio, average global, 100%. Two big legacies. Now, what do we have in terms of downside risks that we should be concerned about? One that was really very heavily discussed during the annual meetings was Europe, and more particularly the Eurozone, because we see a very large and important economic area of the world that is under threat of very low inflation for a long period of time and very low growth. 0.8 to 1% average growth is just not enough to, as I said, create the jobs that are needed, renew the capital expenditures that are required, finance the infrastructures in some countries, and where we see a reluctancy of some of the Euro members to actually get on with the structural reforms that will be necessary in order not to necessarily respond in the next quarter, but raise the growth potential in the medium term so that instead of having 0.8, 1.1% growth, it has more than that. So that's one risk. I'll mention two other briefly. The second one that we see is a financial sector reform that is still ongoing, although we are 6 years after the crisis, and there are clearly countries and financial institutions that still need to deleverage, that still need to review their business model, that still need to reduce their exposure, particularly to non-performing loans, and where structural reforms will help, as well as financial sector reform. And the second big category of risk is the ones that I would call the geopolitical risks. And by that I mean places that you can immediately think of. First one that comes to mind as geopolitical risk is Ukraine, and how the Ukraine crisis uncertainty will be resolved, and the consequences for both the European countries, and particularly the Central and Eastern European countries, and Russia, and how this dispute and this crisis will be resolved. You have major uncertainties arising out of what is happening in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya, and the cloud of uncertainty there. And to top it up, as if it was not enough, we have Ebola on the horizon. And I have to tell you that, coming from Washington and arriving this morning, I looked at whatever was available on screen because I don't think there was many press in the shop available. And I was struck by the difference between the coverage in the US and the coverage in Europe. And I think we all need to be aware of the fact that this Ebola thing is a global virus, it's a global responsibility, and it will be a global liability. And it's spreading fast. I don't mean to raise the alarm system, excessively, but I think that it's been caught late, it's been difficult to contain, and I think, everybody has to really face the issue and try to, first of all, stop it, contain it, and not isolate the countries, but isolate the virus.
And probably the stats that we hear every day of 4,000 are not real, and we don't know their reality.
Number one, we don't know the reality because many people actually go back to the villages or try to go somewhere else because they're not going to be cared in their country. And what's more, we know that it grows exponentially. So the threat is real, and it has to be contained in those three countries. If it spreads towards Nigeria, Senegal, and countries that are highly populated, although they have a better health system, it's going to be a big issue.
So how would you, to summarize, how would you describe the mood in that meeting compared to, I'm sure you remember, different moods when you were a finance minister. You probably went there in 2008, 2009. How would you describe the mood this year?
Well, 2008, 2009, particularly 2008, we thought that we were going to jump off the cliff. We thought that, it was the abyss and the whole thing was going to collapse. It doesn't feel that way because there is recovery, but it feels...
slow recovery.
It's a slow recovery, it's modest, it's fragile, it's uneven. You have the US leading with the UK in the advanced economies. You have China still going strongly. People complain about China, but 7.5, 7.4% is not bad. But you have Brazil pretty much stalled. You have Russia under sanction and pretty much at zero growth level. Mm-hmm. You have India picking up because of the what I would call the Modi effect and the good policies that have been taken by the monetary authorities. So it's a very fragmented landscape. But overall, there was certainly those who left thought, great meetings, we learned a lot, we compared notes, and we have to do the work. I hope that's the last one that they picked up. Not sure.
Okay, thank you very much. In a recent and excellent speech that was called The Economic Power of Women's Empowerment, that you gave in Japan, because you are a role model, so Prime Minister Abe invited you to probably as a symbol and to change the culture in Japan. You said, we know that eliminating gender gaps in labor force participation can lead to big jumps in income per capita. This is true everywhere in the world, but especially in lagging regions like North Africa and South Asia. So can you elaborate a bit more on that? Because it's a very strong statement. Yeah,
I'll give you a few numbers and then I'll tell you the Japan story, because I think it's really, to me, it's stunning. The increase of income per capita as a result of the gender gap being closed can be anywhere between 9 to roughly 23%. 9% is in countries, that are rather progressive, and 23% at the other end, will be in Middle East countries and some of the sub-Saharan African countries. So it's a huge boost to income per capita, and it wouldn't require a lot, but it requires two things. And I'll take the example of Japan because I think it's a good point in case. For those of you who know Japan, I'm going to say some really conventional wisdom stuff that you all know about. Certainly, I know some who know well about that. Japan was the second largest economy in the world. Japan has huge innovation capacity, but Japan has an aging population and a cultural reluctance to accept people from outside Japan. So the solution of having migration of people coming from the Philippines or from other Asian countries is really not an option. And you can discuss that with the officials. The face goes down. They start looking at their feet, and you've lost them. So, aging, fertility rate that is very low, and foreigners not welcome.
So
but the
solution
gap,
is with robots. They need robots.
Yes.
Right?
No, they don't need robots. They need women. And they have unbelievably talented Japanese women. Like in so many other countries of the world, there are more female graduates out of Japanese universities as there are men. But the gender gap is very large in Japan. So others have done it. Hillary Clinton, for instance, has taken that cause and has spoken to the Japanese authorities. I think each and every one of us can do what he or she can in his or her area of business. At the IMF, what we do best is analysis. So we took the Japanese case and we studied in details what it would take and by how much of a percentage it would have to change in order to improve the situation and to respond to a huge labor demand, because the unemployment rate is hardly 3% in Japan. So they badly need labor. When I asked the team, what do you see as a priority for Japan? They said labor market access for women and migrant workers. So we explained all that, we detailed all of it, we analyzed it, put all together the charts and the potential policies, and we took it to Japan. And a very, very fine Japanese woman, who is a great television anchor, took upon herself to actually communicate that, and we had an hour and a half on prime time, big Japanese television to explain the results of the research. Next thing I heard was the new budget of Japan includes a major ticket item for childcare centers. And of course, we identified that policy as critical to help Japanese women to access the job market. Now, not only for child, but also for senior. Because when you have an aging society, women generally end up, in Japan at least, with having to look after the children and having to look after the elderlies. So that was a big success. But the next thing I heard was Prime Minister Abe called me and said, I'm having a big event. My wife, the First Lady of Japan, will participate. Would you please come and explain what you are prescribing? Now, anybody who knows Japan well will understand what a cultural change that is. The First Lady of Japan never, ever participates in any kind of event. They don't talk. They sit. Well, I said, Prime Minister, if you are talking yourself, of course I'm coming. So he said, of course I will talk. So there was a full day focused on that issue. And I think the next, and that takes me to the next nut that needs to be cracked. In addition to having good childcare centers, simplified regulations allowing private sectors to actually put together those childcare centers, you need the cultural change so that it's okay for a woman, and a Japanese woman, to access the job market, to have two children, and then go to work. And clearly the Prime Minister has taken that as a goal, because he knows that he's not just helping the women of Japan, he's not responding to his wife, who is very politely but vocally insisting on the issue, but he's trying to crack an economic issue.
And you are helping him. Good.
Now, the second good news out of Asia is that President Park of Korea is determined to do the same thing. And of course, when Japan does something, few others look around and say, oh, might do the same thing too.
Excellent. Globally, women also tend to, and it's something you refer to be locked out of leadership positions, where gender seems at times to matter more than ability. Women make up only 5% of the Fortune 500 CEOs, I think, only 5%. And overall, they account for only 24% of senior management positions around the world. You said clearly the global economy is not using its productive resources very effectively. We've just talked about Japan, but it's a much more global problem. Do you have, you travel all the time, you've been in different businesses, you've been in politics. Do you have examples of programs or things you've seen that are really efficient to help women break the glass ceiling?
You know, I think there are multiple glass ceilings, and the ones you're talking about are the sort of top-notch glass ceilings, and it's important to crack them. And the more of those 5% women can demonstrate that, of course, they can do it, and the more they can bring along with them and either partner with or coach or support other women with talent and confidence. I shouldn't say that, with talent and ambition, to whom they can give confidence. Because that is something that, I don't know if any of you has read the Kathy Kay book called The Confidence Code, which is really interesting because it details
Do you recommend it?
I do, because I think it's, well, first of all, she says really nice things about me, so, you know.
Okay. We'll read it.
No, but she, you know, she dwells quite deep into why is it that some of us either do not reach to the top or feel uncomfortable doing it. And actually, she told me that she decided to focus with another friend. There were two women writing it. I can't remember the other name. But she had an interview with me, and I explained to her that at whatever level, and having cracked quite a few of those ceilings, I always felt that I had to do my homework, rehearse, verify, check the brief, ask questions, and I still do it. And you know, when she found out that many other women leaders or women in top positions feel the same, whereas she has observed in her very detailed empirical studies that men do not have the same concern, I think this issue of confidence is one that we have to, you know, sort of take ownership of and help others with. But just very briefly, that's one glass ceiling, and it's a tough nut to crack, as the gentleman from this headhunter firm said, because it's been like that for a long time. So I think those in position should really make an effort of bringing other women in. But there are many other glass ceilings at different levels. What we've seen is that when women do not have title to property, when they do not have inheritance rights to the estate of their deceased parents or their deceased husband, when they don't have access to finance, they can't crack those ceilings. So it takes significant reforms and cultural shifts to actually crack those structural barriers in order to make sure that they can push those glass ceilings and prosper. And there are initiatives. Mexico is one country that has decided to take inclusive financing as being targeted on women starting a business, very small entrepreneurs.
We, you heard before recommendations from the CEO Champions Group, this group of leaders who are passionate about women's empowerment. One of the things we said in this group was that we have to set goals. You know, you can call them what you want, but we have to set goals and measure. It's one way to achieve something and to create a momentum. Being the first woman leading the IMF, have you done something about setting goals at the IMF?
It was done before me, so I increased them, and but it was there before me. You know, when I was a young kid, and you know, full of myself, I suppose, I didn't like quotas because I thought we should be hired on the basis of merits, and I had all of those, so I should. But then I got to the chairmanship of Baker McKenzie and looked at the partners' ranks, and it was just appalling. 7% partners. So from there on, I decided that whether you call them quotas, objectives, targets, however, they are necessary because it's just too big a gap. So I didn't like quota. I'm not sure I like targets very much because it's hard. And at the IMF, we have targets. We have 2 categories of targets, and I think it's critical to actually be very granular, because you can set, we can say 50% women. We have 50% women, thank you very much. But then, if you do a granular analysis of where are the women, are they in the assistant ranks, in the research assistant, in the young economist, in the senior economist, in the executive positions, and the more granular you get and the higher you move in the organization, the less the target. But we do have targets, we do measure against targets. As soon as we reach them or exceed them, we move the target zone higher, and it's something where, it's an area where the management have to be absolutely on the ball, and you can't drop that ball. So incidentally, these headhunter firms that talked earlier, we tasked them earlier on, and it was a very senior management position, and I said, okay, here is the profile, and you have to look in those 3 regions, and I only want to see women. And we saw very talented women, okay. And it was a bit of a funny task, I guess, for them. But they
no, but
managed.
I mean, it's one of the things you can do is make sure you always have women that are candidates for.
When people come back and say, "Oh, I couldn't find any," that's rubbish.
I think it's time for it to switch. We decided at the beginning that it would be good for, so that you don't have to turn all the time and to change. Okay, we have a lot of young women here. What advice would you give to a young, talented woman who is not full of herself, but is, expecting more responsibilities, expecting to, and doesn't find that in the company? For some reason. So what should that woman do?
I think first of all she has to understand and internalize the fact that she's an economic potential, that she's an asset, that she delivers value, that she brings to whatever the company, the NGO, the whatever organization she works with. She is never a liability, and that's something that we have to strongly believe in. Because once you believe that, then you can better market yourself. And you can pitch for the work that you feel you can do. And you should, feel strong enough to do it. Sometimes hardly possible, because they are very male-dominated organizations, or very intimidating organizations as well. And in that case, the best is to reach out to others, not necessarily women, to reach out to those that will be prepared to give a hand, to push along, to give a bit of guidance, to coach and monitor, because it's not a given. I remember being a baby lawyer and not having a clue as to how I should structure my brief, and how I should address a client, and how I should what clothes I should wear. It sounds a bit silly, but when you started an organization, you don't know the culture, you don't know the writs and the habits, and having somebody to bring you along is actually really important.
Yes, and we discussed that a lot with the CEO Champions Group, and we said that we must go beyond mentoring. Mentoring is fine and is about having conversations and giving advice, but we like a lot the concept of sponsors, and a sponsor is someone who is in the company really commit himself or herself, saying, I recommend that person for that job, which is much more than mentoring. And I think it's a very good point. When during your... sorry, you want to...
I was going to say, the more qualitative and precise and detailed the annual performance review or the assessment can be, generally the more women will shy. So at least it's I believe, a corporate responsibility to also be very transparent and very clear about both the targets, the performance expectations, and then the review.
Now a more personal question. During your remarkable career in business and politics, did you feel that being a woman was perceived by your colleagues or your peers, either, by the way, as a plus or a minus?
Both. Both, and quite often, actually. And I think the constant struggle that I have faced is not to abuse one or the other. While, not abusing it, not trying to look like the man, continuing to just be myself, and accepting the fact that we can be different in different circumstances. When I was chairman of Baker McKenzie and I had those meetings with my executive committee members, I would, handle the meetings and expect them to deliver without any consideration of gender. But, came the evening, I would go out for dinner with them now and again, but on a couple of nights I would let them get on with their, jokes and things, and I would do something else. I think we also have to allow space for our individuality, and we don't have to necessarily completely associate and try to look alike.
So you are perceived as a great and inspiring role model by many women. How do you feel about that? Does it give you a sense of even more responsibility, more pressure on you? Because everybody is watching what you're doing, everybody is watching what you're wearing, what you're saying, what...
Well, first of all, it's incredibly warm and strong, and it gives enormous energy. I have quite a bit of that, but it's channeling that energy, which is really extremely nice. It's not so much the fact that I'm watched, it's the fact that, I think to myself now and again, if I fail, if I make a mess of this, this will be held not just against me, but it might be held against women in general, and I cannot let that happen. So it is pressure, but it's positive pressure. It's hard. I mean, I see women in the room that have had key responsibilities, and I'm sure they felt the same. You can't let your sisters down. That's the way I see it.
Before we take questions, because we will take questions from the floor, and to go back to the beginning and the global situation, we are seeing very difficult situations in many different parts of the world. And obviously women and children, by the way, suffer a lot of those situations, whether they have to migrate and leave home, and we see a lot of that happening. What can we do about that, and what's the message you want to send to those women?
Well, just to give you an idea of numbers, at the moment, in the whole Middle East arc, you have roughly 11 million displaced people.
11 million.
11 million. And, the burden it causes on countries like Jordan, like Lebanon, that are hosting people fleeing out of Iraq, for instance, or Syria, is just, it's just terrible. So what can you do? I've visited refugees camps, and you are humbled by the hardship, by the suffering, by how little they have. And it's impossible to actually sort of talk about it in this context.
But do you think there should be a stronger global, international
Of course.
momentum?
I mean, the first and foremost thing to maintain and restore is peace. Anybody who's been, facing war, and I talk to a lot of women who have been living or fleeing from countries under war, that's what they will tell you. They will say, okay, we will rebuild the country, but we have to stop the war. And now there is hope. I've spent quite a bit of time with women from Rwanda, for instance, and to see how they have managed to overcome a horrible civil war that has torn the country apart, and how they've managed to reconcile themselves with the other side is incredible. And as Marcus Gill, the Central Bank of South Africa, said to me, she said, well, it's always the men who do the war and the women who repair the damage. So.
Okay, so I think we could take a few questions from the floor. I'm sure there are a 1,000 questions you want to ask.
Is a man for the first question, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Madame
No,
Lagarde,
don't apologize.
Madame Lagarde, let me come back on Ebola.
Yeah.
It was an African disease in the beginning, and suddenly United States, some patient, France, Spain, and it became a worldwide concern. And do you think that IMF can do something? Because we had the same problem with HIV in the beginning, and now we face a sort of solidarity of fear, north and south, and everybody speaks about Ebola. But Ebola is also the revelation of what is the situation in Africa. Do you think IMF can do something?
Well, let me tell you what we did. You're right about the timing. The virus was diagnosed in March this year. And it was, you know, there were about 70 cases in Liberia. And not enough attention was paid to it. Liberia had roughly 51 doctors on the ground for the whole country. Now, I don't want to attribute credits, blames, or whatever, but it's in the course of the summer that people began to really realize that it was getting extremely serious when the number of cases reached the 5,000 and the number of casualties roughly 2,500. At the IMF, what we did is immediately bring the teams back from wherever they were on vacation generally. They started working on the 3 countries, Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia, all 3 under programs for improvement of their macroeconomic situation, which was, by the way, improving. And that's the sad story of it. They were gaining ground when the disease came. And we very, very quickly put together budgetary support of $130 million that were spread between the 3 countries. The board came together as one voice to say, yes, we have to do it. And last week, we had a special meeting together with the World Bank on Ebola for those 3 countries. And for the first time, they heard the managing director of the IMF say, it's okay to increase your fiscal deficit to fight that disease. And this is what will happen. They will need more budgetary support. They will need equipment. They will need doctors. They will need people on the ground to try to stop it and contain it where it is. And then they will have to reconstruct and go about, you know, rebuilding a health system. The particular problem with Liberia is that it had graduated from a very nasty conflict where most of the infrastructure had been destroyed. So the number of clinics, hospitals, and you know, medical people available was just completely inadequate to face the disease. And we will continue to help. That's what I said.
We have a question here or there. Where is the microphone? Okay, we have one here. Yes.
Hi, Mrs. Lagarde. Thank you for this inspiring debate. I have a question which is kind of personal, but it will reach your interrogations. I know that you have studied psychology and social law a long time ago. Once you're taking a decision, very quick decision at your level of position, how do you manage the balance between your cognitive, rational size and the other emotional that is linked to your sensitivity? Sorry, thank you.
Here you go.
I think you hugely overestimate me. I did study law. I did study labor law, fiscal tax law, mergers and acquisitions, what have you, but I've not studied psychology. So I'm not sure that I can actually identify the cognitive relative to the emotional side of my brain. I try to get them to marry with each other, and when I feel overwhelmed, I do 2 things. One is I take a deep breathing and I try to sort of reassess within myself where the situation is and why I should try to be rational more than emotional. And then I take advice, and I work with members of my team, and I don't work as a solo operator assuming that I know everything.
Thank you.
Hello, Ms. Lagarde. Vance Abeuf. I'm working on a think tank fostering dialogue between Southeast Europe and Southeast Asia, where we believe there are a lot of synergies. Going back to the topic of today's lecture on inequality matters, how do you see the advancement of the inclusion of the emerging world in the East and in the South, the Americas, South America, and the BRICS? Thank you.
You know, we are seeing a huge, it's like tectonic plaques moving at the moment. And you don't need to be a genius, you just need to look at the growth numbers. And, you know, who has contributed growth in the last 5 years? The emerging market economies. 80%. 80% of the growth generated in the last 5 years was delivered by the emerging market economies. Okay? When you look at the capital flows, you clearly see that it has headed towards the emerging market economies and certainly stayed with those that have sound macroeconomic policies and perspectives. When I see them on a daily basis, I know that they will continue to play a big and even bigger role. And on the other hand, when you look at the advanced economies, you see that growth is stalling, that there are clearly structural reforms that need to be had. So we're seeing, you know, growth rebalancing at the moment. Not enough of it in terms of surplus versus deficit countries, but in terms of emerging markets versus advanced economies, we are clearly seeing it, and that's the reason why I think that an institution like the IMF has to better represent the emerging market economies, and I'm desperately waiting for the United States to ratify the governance and quota reform of the IMF. It's a bit arcane for those that are not familiar with the IMF, but it's absolutely needed.
Thank you. I think we have another question here, and then here.
No, this has been a wonderful presentation. Shari Berenbach with the U.S. African Development Foundation. Picking up a bit on the growth in the emerging markets, we've heard all the problems in Africa, but we also know that Africa has some of the fastest growing economies really across the globe. I wonder if you might share a bit of your perspective about the growth opportunities in Africa and the particular issue around income disparity and income inequality in Africa.
You're absolutely right. Second fastest growing economic zone in the world is sub-Saharan Africa, following very closely emerging economies of Southeast Asia. So it's growing at roughly 5.5 to 6%. And we have every reason to believe that it will continue to do so.
Income disparity?
Well, just maybe one word about you know, why is it? Well, it's because those countries have actually dealt with a lot of the issues, and they have put together monetary and fiscal policies that is actually protecting them and giving them the buffers that they partly used during the financial crisis. So they went through the financial crisis reasonably well, less exposed, less connected from their financial markets, and stronger fiscal buffers. If you look at sub-Saharan African countries, rather low sovereign debt, rather small fiscal deficits, growing populations, high growth rates, but increasing income disparities in pretty much all African countries. And that's the topic that we are tackling with them now. How to make your growth inclusive and how to better allocate the income that is generated.
Another question here.
So I'm Janet Dalziel from Greenpeace. I was quite surprised when you listed your list of challenges that you see in the upcoming years.
I did not mention climate change.
You did not mention environmental degradation and climate change, and we know that women are going to bear the brunt of climate change. And we also know that, at least at present, growth, which you're seeking to create, is still far from decoupled from climate change, the creators of climate change. So I just wanted to hear what you think about, what your take is on that.
We believe that it's a critical issue that we need to tackle with our core business expertise. You know, if I start telling the teams to work on climate change, I know exactly where I will get a lot of arrows targeted at me because I'm intruding in somebody else's territory. But there's one area of expertise that nobody can dispute and that nobody can challenge, and that's our fiscal expertise. And what we did in the last 12 months is we did a lot of research and published 2 books. I don't think anybody has done that actually at that point. One is, how do you successfully remove fossil energy subsidies that are plaguing the world? About $2 trillion is currently paid in fiscal money to subsidize the use of fossil fuel. And it's, you know, removing them is a win-win because it gives additional revenues to those countries that would better invest in health, education, and social safety net. And it doesn't incentivize those who actually don't really need the subsidies to burn fossil energy. We've taken 27 countries. Not all of them have succeeded, but we've analyzed why some have succeeded, why others have not, how phasing out is better or not, and so on and so forth. So that's publication number 1. The second one we just recently published is called Getting the Price Right. And we believe that at the moment, there are many components that actually fuel climate change that are not priced right, where all the externalities, the damages, the collateral downsides that it has on our planet and our environment are not factored in the price. And our recommendation is, you know, to analyze in very granular details those externalities and make sure that it's inserted in the price so that people actually pay not just for a barrel of oil, but for everything else that goes with it. And I'm not picking oil because I don't like oil particularly, because a lot of the fossil energies, all of them, have that associated with them. Then, of course, you can go into much more details into the time wasted, the death on the roads, the congestions, the time waste, and so on and so forth. And we go through that analysis, and certainly hope that in calibrating tax, in particular, authorities will be well inspired by those 2 books.
Thank you. I'm afraid it's going to be the last question here.
Bonsoir, Christine.
Good evening, Christine.
I was very touched, even personally, when you said, I'm afraid that if I do a mess on something, it's not only for me, but also for what I do represent for women and et cetera, et cetera. And I was very touched on that. I feel the same on another issue. But also the risk is that we are raising the expectation too high. I think that we also have to accept that we have our own fragility. And we should not pretend to be perfect mother, perfect wife, perfect lover, perfect golf, perfect lover, it's not used very much, perfect CEO, and so on and so forth. I think this is a message we have to pass, because otherwise we pretend to be an Oscar winner on every single field and etc. But one thing I wanted to ask you, because I feel badly on that, I don't know. What do you do when you meet incompetent women that pretend to be very competent?
Only a woman could ask that question. I couldn't.
Emma, I want to pay tribute to you. You're not perfect. I'm not perfect. I screwed up many times in my life, in many corners of my life. So let's be realistic about it. And sorry for the bad language that I should not have used.
It's already tweeted.
No. Please. I hope there is somebody who gives me the absolution. You know what I do? I tell her, but I tell her privately. I never tell her in front of anybody else. That's all. Yeah.
Anthony? No. Sorry. Yeah, okay.
Hello, Christine. I'm Vivian from São Paulo, Brazil.
Hello.
And my question is coming back about the Ebola issue, because it must be prioritized this time because humanity is at stake. And recently, Avaz has raised more than thousands of volunteers to help doctors and scientists to help with this case. And the NGOs are being orchestrated. And my question is, how is this effort between the World Bank and the FMI and all of the NGOs and institutions is being handled by you and all of the government? Thank you.
It's such a good question, because everybody wants to do something, and yet the countries at the receiving hand are sometimes facing the tough choice of saying, no, we can't land that plane because the runway will not hold it, or no, we can't host those doctors because we have so many other things to do, or we have just started. So,
how can we orchestrate it?
Okay, the coordination has now been taken over by the United Nations. And Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was last week in Washington with the IMF and the World Bank and made that line very clear. He said now the United Nations Secretary General coordinates. He has appointed representatives in all 3 countries, and everything is to be channeled through the UN. Now, you will have some countries that will just ignore the UN because they don't trust the UN, because they don't feel the UN is efficient, and so on and so forth. But I think a lot of us will actually try to bring our efforts together, at least liaising, if not being sort of instructed by the United Nations, but having enough coordination from there. Now, for us, it's a lot more simple because we give budgetary support. So once the board of the IMF decided the allocation of $130 million, within 5 days, the cash was in the bank of the 3 countries. So, you know, with money, in a way, it's easier. And when it's not intended for a particular procurement, where you have to check that it's done in accordance with the principles and the protocol and the laws and so on and so forth, it makes our life, and hopefully their life, much easier.
Okay, very last question here.
Okay. Hello, Mrs. Lagarde.
Hello.
You mentioned earlier what's happening in Syria and how Jordan and Lebanon are paying the big price. I come from Lebanon, and believe me, we are a population, including the Palestinian refugees, about 4 million people. Until now, we have more than 2 million Syrians on our land. It's not the same case in Jordan. It's not the same case in Turkey. And the international community is promising Lebanon to help, but it's taking so much time because you know, the situation in Lebanon, they are not dealing with the problem in a professional way, but nevertheless, we, the Lebanese, are suffering from this, and we are hearing that this war will last minimum for 3 years concerning ISIS, and God knows when we will get rid of Bashar al-Assad. So, do we have to expect more and more burdens concerning the situation in that part of the world?
I wish I could tell you no, but number one, I don't have that crystal ball. Number two, I think that every expert on those issues recognizes that it's not something that is going to go away shortly. I've visited refugees camps in Jordan. I've visited other places. I know that Lebanon deals with refugees in a different way. Your government has decided, at least for the moment, it's fidgeting whether not to do it or not, but it's decided not to open refugees camps in the hope that it will not settle refugees in Lebanon. How tenable is that? How long that can be, with more, 50% of your population having increased in a matter of a year, is really a wonder. And moving from 4 to 6 in such short span of time, with everything from school, from water system, from drainage, from just everything, it's. I don't think that Lebanon will be able to master that just on its own.
Okay, so now they want me to lie, and this is the last question.
Okay, so, Madame, we are a group of women who really would like that you could be the next president of the Republic in France. Please.
It's not a question, Christine, it's not a question.
Fantastic.
D'accord, non? Oui. Et on pourrait le faire? Il faut qu'on monte un groupe pour ça. Ouais, je suis d'accord, moi. Il faut qu'on le fasse, il faut qu'on la fasse. D'accord, c'est fini. Et bien voilà. Et moi, je vais parler à Emma, parce que j'adore Emma, c'est plein de Vas-y.
Ah.
J'avais des Théodule.
On a dit qu'on allait toutes. Il faut qu'elle vienne, non? Elle ne le fera pas, hein? Je sais pas. Je suis juste...
So, thank you again, Olivier. Thank you so much. Thank you, Madame Lagarde. So, I know better than to talk to you for very long at the end of a day like today, and certainly at the end of a session like that. I wish you all a wonderful evening. We've got our wonderful Quartier Gala that starts in just a couple of minutes. And please come back tomorrow morning. We've got our Friday session, and we'll be back here to talk about Japan at 11:15 tomorrow. I wish you a wonderful evening. Thank you again.
Un jour je suivrai ton étoile et j'atteindrai plus haut que moi